I previously worked in what you would call, I guess, the disabilities industry. Specifically, I worked for an agency that provided services like an assistance in general terms for adults with cognitive, intellectual, developmental disabilities. The whole, from autism to schizophrenia to cerebral palsy. I did that for about 3 or 4 years before it got to me to the point that I had to leave my job. It's just corruption by sheer incompetence or greed. Greed powers it. The people are the product in that industry, and it wears things down. I don't hard for me to really describe. For context, I started in the industry because about 4 or so years ago, I was recovering from a case of fairly severe agoraphobia where I wouldn't leave the house, much less my bedroom, for weeks to months at a time. And I had just gotten over that, and I had a job. I wasn't happy in that job. I was working retail at the time, so I decided that I wanted to give back now that I had been in recovery from my own disability to people who were much less lucky than me in being able to find that independence. So I applied for a job as what they call a direct support professional, is the term in the industry, which is as nebulous as it sounds. You're the one in direct contact with the individuals, the clients, providing support and assistance for them in day-to-day life. Our agency offered, a broad range of services. We had like job coaching and employment rehabilitation program. There was the day program, which is essentially adult daycare. There is a number of advocacy groups. Previously, they used to help organize. I don't know how much they do it except for PR these days because they don't seem interested in actually advocating for their individuals. And what I worked in was the residential supports section of the industry, which most people would know that as like a group home, that kind of setting. And there were red flags from the get-go, but I wanted to give everyone the benefit of the doubt. And, I was like, it couldn't be this bad. It's just fatigue from the coworkers, working in through the pandemic, because I had actually joined this agency pretty much at the height of the pandemic. So I figured it was just the reason everyone was complaining about management and all that was just stress from the pandemic. I gave everyone the benefit of the doubt, but it just, 4 years ahead of time, I finally see, oh, it's always going to be like this. The pandemic was nearly over and nothing had changed. In fact, it had gotten worse. I started my first assignment that I was in. I wasn't suspicious that they had assigned me to a program that was a 50-minute commute from my home. I just figured, oh, they needed the staff there. They did. And I soon found out why. I was working in a group home with 4 clients in it. One client had cerebral palsy and was bound to a wheelchair. The other two had epilepsy and were completely nonverbal. It could only really, I don't communicate, I guess would be the word, and basically screams, for lack of a better word. And another individual who had very severe anxiety and schizophrenia and obsessive compulsive tendencies. And while I was there, I was one of the only staff that was properly documenting and reporting on what was happening in that home. And with the three other individuals, they had no way to defend themselves, obviously. One being bound to a wheelchair, the other two being severely epileptic and not having much mobility or such. And the individual with schizophrenia, he would do things like if the man in the wheelchair was relaxing in like a doorway or something, he didn't like that because of his OCD. He wanted everything to be squared off and organized. So he would grab the 300-pound wheelchair with a 250-pound man in it, and he was strong enough to strong arm it to where he'd want him to have his wheelchair placed. He, designated seating. He felt like each person in the home had to have their own seat. So the one individual that was severely epileptic and had trouble standing at all would do things like pull him out of his seat and cause him to fall on the floor, and so on and so forth. The other epileptic individual mostly stayed in his bedroom listening to his music, so he wasn't in as much possible danger that I felt. So I reported and reported. I recorded everything, and several times I would get not full write up, but pressured by administration to rephrase the way I was reporting things, because it would possibly lead to that individual having to be moved to another agency that was better equipped for his needs, for his obsessive compulsive schizophrenia. And I found out that the reason that they would pressure me like this, and among other things that would happen in that home, that the reason they were pressuring me was because not only was that individual allotted a fairly large budget for his care by state funding that the agency would receive as payment for taking care of him in the group home, his parents were also large contributors, donators to the agency. So that lasted a long time, and I'd find out things like that this individual with schizophrenia at one point had, before I had joined the agency, had taken a staff member's head, grabbed them by the back of the head, and slammed their head repeatedly into a kitchen table. And another staff member, we had what are called control techniques or crisis management techniques, which is more or less techniques to restrain someone when they're putting themselves or others in danger. So he was put into a hold, a bear hug more or less, to stop him from slamming a man's head repeatedly into a table. And the staff that put him in the restraints, not restraints as in shackles or anything, just a bear hug, was later fired because the parents that were contributors to the agency's funding had complained about that incident, that he was restrained.
That easy, huh? Just kicked out.
Yes, and that happened a lot. There was a lot of times where staff would be booted to the wayside, kicked out, completely fired, or transferred to different programs because they threatened the money that was coming in. I also witnessed there in that program a significant amount of neglect. The two epileptic individuals were completely incontinent, so they wore adult diapers, and I worked the night shift. So sometimes when I would come in at night, they would have been wallowing in soiled clothes for I don't know how long, was when they would have last been attended to their hygiene. So there was also just staff neglecting some of these individuals. The only one who could communicate verbally in that home was the man bound to his wheelchair, and he always, behind closed doors, when he was alone with staff, would say how much he hates the situation there and how he's afraid and such. And I would report that, and it would just get brushed under the rug. So I ended up requesting a transfer because my vehicle that I used to get, like I said, it was a 50-minute commute to that program, and my vehicle had been totaled, so I had no way to commute to the program anymore. And I requested a transfer, and I was transferred to another program within walking distance of my home.
Did you have any second thoughts before transferring? I know once you're in that hellhole and you're in a position like that, you also feel partially responsible, especially with the people that you get close to, regardless of who you're taking care of.
Yes, definitely. I felt immensely guilty and still immensely guilty, because it was like I had abandoned not just my coworkers who were in that situation, but the three individuals and even the one who was the more dangerous individual that I wasn't, I had abandoned them. I hadn't done my best to put the care forward.
Do you still feel that today?
I still feel that and more.
The system that you were working for at that time is one where the personal responsibility is meant to seem like it's yours, but the money that comes from getting the work done is not. You were not being treated fairly, and the system as a whole is what's wrong. You being trapped in a situation where you can't help these people, if they don't have anyone else to help them, it's not because you failed them, it's because, like you've been talking about, the entire system around you isn't built to help them. It's built to take their money and keep them alive.
That's very true. It wasn't that way before. I actually, I live, I'll say, in one of the northern states with very good public assistance programs, some of the best in the country. And this agency previously was fairly recognized for sticking to what its mission statement is of assisting individuals with these disabilities. And I would learn eventually why that mission fell by the wayside. That's a very sad and unfortunate story. The actual founder of that particular agency had passed away some years ago, and his replacement as the director of the entire agency, I don't even know if it was greed on her part personally or just incompetence of thinking that this is what needed to be done so that they would have the money, of course, to support these individuals we're caring for. But she had basically driven things downhill very quickly in terms of staff morale and, in my opinion, in quality of care for our clients. When I requested a transfer, I still believe that my transfer went through so quickly was because me documenting what was going on in that house. They felt that I was making trouble there, that I would get in the way of the money eventually, that, state regulation would get involved and fine the agency for a lack of care for neglect. So I was swiftly transferred to a location much closer to where I live. I was able to ride my bike to work from then on until I had acquired a new car. And at that program, it was better in a way, but that was because the individuals I worked with were a lot more independent and did not need as much oversight, I guess I would say.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, as things would happen, I would not only witness things I would see as neglect, I would see again the interests of money get in the way of the safety and health of these individuals. When I started out, there was an individual who was very elderly. They were diagnosed with dysphagia, I think was the term, which means they have severe issues with swallowing. So their diet, they had to have a completely pureed diet. And even then, they would still cough and sputter a lot. And I would hear things like the administration saying, don't document it this way, don't document it this way, because that would lead to him needing, his doctors determining that he would need surgery to have a feeding tube in his abdomen so that he could get proper nutrition. And the reason that they would say to, it wasn't to care for him, like to not risk going through the surgery. It's because if a client has a feeding tube or very, surgical medical equipment like that, we could no longer keep them within the care of our agency. They would have to be moved either to another agency with proper nurses on staff or a nursing home, essentially. Thankfully, he did end up getting the procedure done and moving on to another agency's care, thanks to the efforts of his family in making sure he got the care he needed. Once his domicile was vacated, in that sense, it was empty for a while. At that point, I had been working for about a year with this agency, and I had heard many stories. I heard the incompetence and neglect within that agency had actually gotten the previous resident of one of these domiciles killed.
Oh.
They became ill and were refusing to get out of their bed because they were very sick. And the management had chalked it up to what is called a behavior, an adverse behavior. They thought it was a behavioral issue. This individual had severe sleep apnea, and they still were saying it was a behavioral issue when staff kept reporting that they are not okay. Even for you have to run fire drills every month within this industry to make sure these individuals we're caring for are still capable of evacuating the premises in case of a fire, either with assistance or independently, so that there's always a plan in case of an emergency. And they would forge the fire drill records because that individual would not get out of bed when the fire alarm went off, so that they wouldn't have to move her to a different program or different agency where that would happen. Thankfully, there was never a fire, but unfortunately, they would eventually, due to whatever was ailing them that had them bedridden for so long, pass away. Either a heart attack, some sort of heart failure, or pneumonia. I never learned how, but they didn't get the care they needed. That pushed me, instead of away from the agency, I felt that I had a duty now to protect my clients. These people were my neighbors. They're part of my community. And I felt that I had a duty to assist them in any way, even as my own health was failing. So I stuck it out. I witnessed more things as time went on. They moved because different programs within the residential services had different levels of supervision and different levels of assistance. There were clients that were moved from one program of very high 24/7 supervision into a less supervised program where still they would need very direct supervision, even though it wasn't exactly a good fit for their needs or their mobility even. And I reported my feeling on this.
Did you ever have a favorite client? Because if so, I'd actually like to hear a little bit of story behind that.
I wouldn't say that I really had favorites. They were all fairly much my favorite. I have plenty of stories, both good and bad, of the clients that I had worked with. There was an incident that was somewhat stressful where a client had jumped out of a window about 15 feet from the ground, buck naked, tuck and roll, and ran around the house. Thankfully, this house was, I'll say, far from civilization, and it was the middle of the night, so there was no one around to see that except for staff. There are so many funny stories. I remember I had one client who I'll say was an alcoholic, and he would randomly call the house phone for the program I was at from either the casino or the strip club from a city that was a number of hours away that he had taken a bus ride to, because he is fully allowed to do that. He's a free man. And he would just take a bus ride all the way out there to hit the bars or gamble and say some fairly misogynistic things while he was on the phone about the women that he was, I will say, partaking in. That was certainly a unique man that I met there. Just makes me so happy remembering the good times when I worked there, because it wasn't all bad.
That's good that you have some nice memories to look back on, dude.
I remember taking someone to the beach because they wanted to watch the sunset. I remember so many very funny incidents. Some of them a little more identifiable than others. I will risk this one because it is hilarious. When you work in this industry, a lot of the time, medications. So one of the things we have to do is help handle medications. If they can't medicate self, we manage the medication, put it in a little cup and hand it to them. Asylum style, I guess you would say.
I've been through that. I know how that's done.
And so the meds get delivered by a mobile pharmacy company so that we normally don't have to go out and pick them up. because it's more efficient that way. They come in neatly dated blister packs, so everything is easy to document and keep track of. At one point, I was assisting an individual with his medications. We had a line of several individuals I was assisting in that program, and the doorbell rings. So the individual that's waiting in line turns and goes to answer the door, and it's of course the delivery man, and he's been in the system long enough. He recognizes that, oh, this is the pharmacy guy that has come there. And the words that came out of his mouth to tell staff who was at the door was to yell, and this is in a complex where it's not just individuals with disabilities, there's also, they have neighbors. And what came out of his mouth to announce who was at the door was, "The man with the drugs is here," at the top of his lungs for all the neighbors to hear.
Technically correct.
He was technically correct. It was even funnier because that area, I will say it wasn't a good area. There's a lot of good that happened, and unfortunately it's just that the bad had gotten to me. And that was during this whole time that I've been describing, and I stuck it out because I wanted to assist these clients. I felt a duty to them. Like I said, I had witnessed someone being moved into a program who had mobility needs, and the home that they were moved to was not the best for their mobility needs. I had to call 911 at one point because this individual who I had previously reported my concerns to about their mobility needs had fallen and smashed his face into a bookshelf, blood gushing everywhere. I thought he broke his nose. Thankfully, it was just a bit of a laceration from the corner of the bookshelf. He got stitched up. It was all fine. That was scary, though. Same individual had fallen several times at that program and been injured, unfortunately. Thankfully, he, as far as I know, is still there, and thankfully has not been seriously done in by that yet. And that is part of what I would call the administrative negligence of the agency, because they would do things like this to balance the books. They said it was all about money. In the system, that man had a higher tier of care than other individuals in that program. So to balance the books at that program, they moved him into the program so that that program would make more money, even though it was a terrible fit and actively dangerous for him. Not even due to staff or other individuals, just because of the environment of that building. And that was always one of the most worrying parts. There were times when staff that were in positions above me, but working directly with our clients still, non-administrative, were financially exploiting one of the clients who was able to work his own job and make his own money. And they had financially exploited him for, like free food and such, which obviously we're very much not supposed to do. There was neglect many times where individuals just would not get the assistance they needed. And part of that was also the administrative negligence. There was a constant battle because obviously for purposes of billing, because this is all run through Medicaid or Medicare, depending on what kind of insurance they have. And so there has to be documentation for billing purposes. And there was a constant struggle with administration wanting us to, sometimes it would be, oh, don't do this for this individual, don't document this for this individual because that'll make it look like they need more assistance, and then we have to move programs around. That gets in the way of the money. And then conversely, we follow those orders, help try and assist these individuals with becoming more independent on the things administration had remarked about that we need to promote their independence on, so we look good with state. And then they would go back and it was like, so why aren't you documenting more? Why aren't you doing more? And it's like, because you told us not to. Well, the reason they're coming at us is because you document less, they make less money. You document more, it makes them look bad for the state regulators. And that was a constant tug of war.
And of course, the one that they want is for you to lie on the documentation.
Yes. One of the things that I heard at one point slip from the mouth, probably unintentionally, from one of my managers was, don't lie on your documentation, but, and then they kind of trailed off because they realized what they're implying, which, that is forging an official document. That's actually, in this case, that's fraud. It's insurance fraud if we lie on our documentation. So we could end up getting in trouble. And that's one of the reasons I inevitably had to depart, was because feeling like I had a guillotine over my head for all this responsibility, because the administrators are up in their ivory tower at the main HQ of the agency. They're not the ones that are going to get in trouble when shit hits the fan. They get the protection of, oh, we weren't there to directly witness it, or so on and so forth. They can always do that. So it's always us lower level staff that have the sword of Damocles above our head. And all of that adding together eventually broke me. I didn't even put in a 2 weeks. I sent an email to the HR department saying that I would not be returning to work, because I had become so stressed at that point that I had a complete mental breakdown and relapsed into my agoraphobia. And I still feel terribly guilty. I feel like I abandoned my clients because it got to a point where I couldn't help take care of them if I couldn't take care of myself.
Yeah.
So I had to leave.
It's a very difficult decision to make, especially not only since you have your own personal responsibility with each of your clients. It also feels like you're turning your back to some of your coworkers, but I want to let you know that's not the case. This was stated before, the place that you work in is built on a system. What their system is supposed to do is, after someone like you would leave, this is not an uncommon occurrence in that system, just because it's fucking awful. I'm gonna be honest.
It was that awful system led to just a revolving door of staff. Nobody that I had started with at the agency, except for a few who had been there for long before me, who were very dedicated to the mission, I will say that they were of a different generation. They were of that hardier generation, our parents' generation, essentially.
Yeah.
For those of us that are essentially millennials. And they were able to stick it out because they had things built up for them. They had, already established their trenches, and they held out. And I feel so much for those coworkers. They were my favorite coworkers to work with. They were amazingly strong people to have put up with that system and continued to support our clients who had been there for much longer than I had. They had seen it when that founder of our agency had first passed away and things started sliding downhill, and they continued to stick it out.
Have you been able to reconvene with some of your old coworkers? Any form of connection, social media, any form of being able to at least see them again? Because maybe it might not be in the workplace, but the bond you guys share there is still very real. I know I still hang out with coworkers from my first job that I don't work there anymore.
To some extent, yes. They are older, so they don't quite understand all of the technologies that are about. So it's not like we're on Discord or anything together, but they do occasionally text me on, holidays and such to ask me how I'm doing. They're amazing people. They were essentially the moms of these programs.
Yeah.
Everyone's favorite aunt, anything like that. They're amazingly strong women.
Yeah.
And occasionally a man.
My question for this was essentially, when it comes to this job, what were the qualifications you had, or what were the ones that were required of it? I guess both.
That's another thing, actually. I thank you for asking that question, because that's one of the problems with this industry. The qualifications are as follows. Do you have a GED or high school diploma? And that's all.
That's insane.
Oh my god.
That's nuts. No background check, no anything, no support.
There is a background check. The only thing the background check checks for is if you are on the national registry for basically things like child neglect, child endangerment, senior neglect, senior endangerment, so on and so forth.
Job you're talking about is that's occupational therapy stuff. That's college degree things.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely not something that I understand that there might be short staff, but there's a requirement for a reason. It's not a safe place for the workers. let alone the people inside there and the people that genuinely need support.
It sounds like another massive, massive crack in our social security system in America, where we're so confident that the system works because when you look this direction, it does. And then you look at this direction and you see what's wrong.
Yeah, that is
I mean,
very much true.
did they give you any kind of training, or did they just say go for it?
They did. I won't say it was very good training. What I used to say to people when they asked me what I did for a living was, I'm a nurse with none of the certifications, half the respect, and half the paycheck.
Ugh.
Because I did everything that a registered or certified nurse would do. I was, assisting individuals with mobility issues in just transferring from bed to a wheelchair, which is something you normally think that's what nurses do. I had to do that. I wasn't even trained on that, by the way, barely. When I had to help a man from bed into his wheelchair, I basically had to wing it. I had to figure it out on my own. Thankfully, somehow, despite me being somewhat of a soft person, I was able to deadlift a 200-pound man from his bed into a wheelchair, essentially.
See, that's what's so scary is you have to have training to do that consistently, safely. And you had to figure it out on the job. Like, you could have torn a muscle or, like, cracked a bone, and this person could sue the shit out of you or the company you work for. Like, it's not even business smart to not train you on this stuff.
Mm-hmm. Oh, we were trained, just never in the ways we needed.
Mm-hmm.
And the training was, when it was there, okay, this is hilarious. Our training for what I mentioned earlier, the crisis management, the control techniques for restraining someone with a psychiatric condition, the manuals we were handed for our training during those classes literally had, the illustrations were the men in white suits, like old-fashioned asylum men in white
God.
suits, orderlies.
Do you think these were like books from like the 90s at the earliest, probably, that you were seeing?
Yes.
Oh my God.
Very, very possibly. And it was the same with a lot of our training. The like wheelchair transfer training, when I finally did get it, which I got long after I had to figure it out, with just my coworkers kind of guiding me along, or the individual themselves many times would instruct me on how to assist them, which I loved that. They were, society does not give individuals with disabilities enough credit. They are not invalids. And especially when they've lived with assistance for so long, they know what they need, and they'll make it known. If they have communication skills, if they're not mute or such, and even some that are mute, they will make sure you know what they need assistance with.
We infantilize people with disabilities a lot.
Yeah.
They truly do.
Tell me a story, I wanna hear it. You might think it's boring, but I'm interested.